Okay. On the syllabus, there are, if you're taking it for credit, which I understand you are,
Yes.
you'll have class attendance participation is 25% of the final grade. The midterm exam is 25% of the final grade, which second page of the syllabus gives you the dates of the exams. The final exam would be 25% of the final grade, and the paper that you would need to write, which is also 25% of the grade. And the paper topic should be why I choose to either opt in or opt out of self-employment tax on my ministerial earnings.
Okay.
You cannot really start on that until after our third class meeting, which is when we talk about opting in and out of Social Security and Medicare earnings, taxes, self-employment taxes, and what's required to do that. So next week is the first time you can actually do something about that.
Okay.
But that will be due by the date of the final exam, the end,
Okay.
of, end of the semester rather. Semester goes through, I believe, April 14th or 15th, something like April 14th, I think it is. So that's will be the due date. How long have you been preaching?
I have not been preaching.
Okay.
Yes.
So this will, one of the options on opting in or out of Social Security Medicare tax is that you have the first 2 years when you report ministerial income over $400 on your tax return.
Okay.
So you got time to do that, so you can make an informed decision and do that. So let me just go ahead and share some screen with you. Okay, do you see on the screen the introductory session?
I do.
And it says PTP session 105. It shouldn't, but something I copied. I developed this course in 2013 and 14 at the request of David Decker.
Okay.
I've taught it about every 4 years since then. I taught it at Polishing the Pulpit in 1917 or 2017.
Mm-hmm.
That's what all the verbiage is at the top there. I apologize for not having fixed that and giving you correct verbiage for as of today. I am a CPA. I've been a CPA for 40 plus years. So first certified in Alabama and then reciprocal license here in Georgia, where I've lived since 1982. No, 1984 in Georgia. And I've done my own thing, run my own CPA firm since 2002. So for the last 20 plus years, I've been doing that.
Okay.
There. Okay, the first thing we're going to talk about tonight is where the law comes from and who qualifies to be a minister. Congress actually passes laws which become part of the Internal Revenue Code. The IRS writes regulations to interpret the law. And in the slides, you will see me refer to those as Treasury Regulation, TREAS dot REG dot 1 dot, and then a number. The number, first part of the number indicates the part of the code that they're writing the regulation for. And then the rest of the number would be the regulation date and the year that it was issued and what it's about, et cetera, et cetera. So as Congress has the Internal Revenue Code, as IRS writes regulations and interpret that code, sometimes you will see some things happen in court to clarify the law and the regulations. So if somebody doesn't like what they did, they can go to court. If they don't like the way they were treated, they can go to court. So if they go to court, and if they issue a ruling on the court case, then that would be indicated by a footnote of XXX, F or C, page, blah, 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 and then a year. So when we see something when you see something like that, that's a court case. And we'll talk about court cases in a few minutes. Then they have something that happens not as much now as it used to be, because they charge a lot of fees for these now. They have private letter rulings. Private letter rulings cannot be a precedent unless you were issued the private letter ruling. If it's issued to you, then that's the way that the IRS tells you how they're going to treat your specific situation in a private letter ruling. But someone else can't rely on that as a precedent and say, well, I did this and this private letter ruling says that's okay. So, but the IRS only acknowledges private letter rulings for the person, the party to whom they issued the private letter ruling. So, who is a minister? According to the IRS rules, a minister is someone who is duly ordained, commissioned, or licensed, and who is engaged in the ministration of sacerdotal functions, or the conduct of religious worship, or the control, conduct, and maintenance of religious organizations, including religious boards, societies, other integral agencies of such organizations, under the authority of a religious body constituting a church or a church denomination. Now, we'll get deeper into this a little later on, and we'll talk about in the Church of Christ, where we don't have a duly a licensing board, a commissioning board, an ordaining board. So what happens? But that is according to IRS rules, who is qualified as a minister. The courts have added the additional point that you are considered to be a religious leader by your church or parent denomination. That item's not included in the Internal Revenue Code or Treasury Department regulations. Rather, it's been added by the courts as a determining factor they have chosen to use. So they add the separate indication of a minister as someone considered to be a religious leader by your church or denomination. We used the phrase earlier, sacerdotal functions. What are sacerdotal functions? If you officiate at weddings or at funerals or houses of mournings, that clearly falls, the IRS letter ruling, private letter ruling they issued in 1989, clearly falls within the phrase sacerdotal functions. Later on in that private letter ruling, they said he was authorized to, and in fact did administer sacerdotal functions. He administered the ordinances of baptism and Holy Communion, presided in marriage and funeral ceremonies. So a sacerdotal function is basically those functions that we think of as a minister does. Conducts weddings, conducts funerals, preaches, teaches, those sorts of things. Those constitutes what they call sacerdotal functions. So the courts have ruled various rulings in 1989 in Knight versus Commissioner, which was the tax court ruling. They said there were 5 factors that made a minister a minister. Do they administer sacraments? Do they conduct religious worship services? Do they control, conduct, and maintain a religious organization? Do they ordain? Are they ordained, commissioned, or licensed? And are they considered to be a spiritual leader? Nothing new here, nothing different here. We've seen all this before. This is just telling you again what the courts have held. Now, on the next page, we see that item 4, that they are ordained, commissioned, or licensed is required. The preponderance of the evidence for the other 4 items would determine if one qualifies as a minister. So if we look at the other 4 items, administer sacraments. I don't know about where you go to church, but where we attend, it's rare that the minister is actually serving the Lord's Supper. Now, he's preaching. He may be doing some announcements or something on the worship services. He rarely leads prayer. He rarely leads singing, but he primarily preaches. Our preachers generally do not control, conduct, or maintain a religious organization, but they are considered to be spiritual leaders. So the preponderance of evidence, all of the other things in 1, 2, 3, and 5, and it's essential that they be ordained, commissioned, or licensed. But we'll see what the so if the Internal Revenue Code and the courts both hold that being ordained, commissioned, or licensed is a requirement of being recognized as a minister, what about ministers in the church who have no ordaining, commissioning, or licensing body? And the question I've asked before in class and never had anybody take me up and say they are, is that they have not been ordained, commissioned, or licensed. In the tax court case in 1993, Reader versus Commissioner, they said that duly ordained, commissioned, or licensed did not depend upon the timing or the fact of ordination, but instead depended upon when you assume the duties and functions of a minister. So anyone who assumes the duties and functions of a minister, although they have not been, have no commissioning body or licensing body or ordaining body, if they assume the duties and functions of a minister, they will be recognized by the courts and by the IRS as being a minister. In the Ballinger case in 1984, the 10th Circuit Court case. Not all churches or religions have a formally ordained ministry, whether because of the nature of their beliefs or the lack of a denominational structure, or a variety of other reasons. We interpret Congress language providing exemption for any individual who is a duly ordained, commissioned, or licensed minister of a church to mean that the triggering event is the assumption of the duties and functions of a minister. So it doesn't cause us a problem because we don't have ordaining bodies or licensing bodies or a commissioning body in the church. The courts have held that if you're doing the work of a minister, they will assume and they will base any judgment on the work that you're doing and the work that you do, the tax return you file, et cetera, et cetera. Eight examples in the Treasury regulations of services performed by ministers in the exercise of their ministry. The first one is the performance of sacerdotal functions. We talked about that earlier. Sacerdotal functions are things like weddings, baptisms, funerals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you perform those, you're a minister. The conduct of religious worship qualifies you as a minister. The administration and maintenance of a religious organization. The administration and maintenance of a religious organization's internal agencies. So if you had a denominational and that denomination and they had a board that does a bookstore or a college or anything like that, and you worked in performing, administering, and maintaining that agency, you would be qualified as a minister. The performance of teaching and administrative duties at theological seminaries, as GSOP would qualify there if you taught or did administrative duties at GSOP, other theological seminaries. Service performed by a qualified minister as an employee of the United States. Now there is an exception here. A chaplain in the armed forces whose service is considered to be that of a commissioned officer in his capacity as such, and not as a minister in the exercise of his ministry. So service performed by a qualified minister as an employee of the U.S., except those who are chaplains in the armed forces, or states, territories, or possessions, or political subdivision of any of the foregoing, or the District of Columbia, is in the exercise of his ministry, provided the service performed includes such services as are ordinarily the duties of a minister. So there, I said there are 8 examples. The first 6 are on this page. The last 2 are on this page. Number 7, all services performed by a minister in the conduct of religious worship, the administration of sacerdotal functions, or the control, conduct, and maintenance of an organization that is operated as an integral agency of a religious organization under the authority of a religious body constituting a church or church denomination. And the final example they give in the Treasury regulations is service performed by a minister pursuant to an assignment or designation by his church for an organization which is not a religious organization, nor operated as an integral agency of a religious organization. So if you had an adoption agency, that's not a religious organization, not a agency of a religious organization, but if a church assigned someone to work with that adoption agency, their work could be considered a minister. They could be considered doing their work as a minister because they're doing what their church has assigned them to do. And you see the regulation, Treasury Regulation 1.107-1A. 107 is the section of the Internal Revenue Code which defines what a minister is. So next page. Who is a minister? These people have been held to be ministers. An author in a revenue ruling. Once again, revenue rulings cannot be precedent, but for this person in revenue ruling issued in 1959, they were assumed to be a minister because they were writing religious books for use by churches and denominations. In 1971, a revenue ruling was issued to a chaplain, not in the armed forces. If he were in the armed forces doing chaplain work, he would not be considered a minister, but a chaplain not in the armed forces was recognized under revenue ruling in 971-258 as a minister. A church administrator, a revenue ruling based in 1981. He was administering a church, and he was not a preacher per se, but he was determined to be a minister in that revenue ruling. A parachurch minister. And let me just jump ahead a little bit. A parachurch is an organization established outside the church which seeks to provide ministerial functions through means other than the church. Examples would include World Video Bible School, In Search of the Lord's Way, Gospel Broadcasting Network, as long as those types of works are independent of a local congregation or local eldership. Now, I mentioned earlier that GSOP could be preaching or teaching in GSOP could be considered a minister, because GSOP is considered to be a function of the church, and teaching and preaching for the church, GSOP would be that. So let's go back. A parachurch minister, someone who, for example, Phil Sanders works for In Search of the Lord's Way. He would, as a parachurch minister, he would be a minister. And that came in from a tax court ruling in the year 2000. A teacher or an administrator. The IRS letter ruling in 78 held that those people would be ministers. So we've considered and looked at who is ministers, who is considered to be a minister. So let's look now at somebody who is not considered to be a minister. A counselor. IRS private letter rulings based in 92, 91, and 92. In both these situations, the minister spent 50 to 75% of his time in counseling and only 5% performing duties such as the conduct of religious worship or the performance of sacerdotal functions. And in both those cases, the letter rulings that they issued in 91, 92, those people were considered not to be ministers. So, any questions?
No, it's pretty straightforward.
Okay. Well, let me save this, and any questions we have, we'll go take a small break, a short break right now, and I will set up the slideshow for the next sessions, and we will go into that. So let's stop sharing there. And recording.